Welcome to ideaXme, the platform for sharing innovative ideas and inspiring stories. We are talking to people who are shaping the future and moving the human story forward. My name is Karen Potter, and I'm the Sustainability Ambassador. Climate change is a defining issue of our time. For decades, scientists have provided irrefutable evidence of the human contribution to global warming, and for decades, these messages have fallen on deaf ears. That is until climate change started to affect us in our own backyards, in our communities, when we began to see for ourselves change in weather patterns, record-breaking temperature month after month, year after year, fires and droughts and floods. We began to realize the scientists were right. This has created a social movement across the globe, the climate strikes led by Greta Thunberg and other global youth movements. Extinction Rebellion, who have a certain middle-class appeal, have started to lead a clamoring for change. People are demanding that government take a leadership role. And suddenly we're hearing voices in support of clean energy and divestment from fossil fuels, for eating less meat and being more sustainable, for finding ways to travel, perhaps fly less. These are messages that seemed unimaginable just a few short years ago. Nearly 2 years ago, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded that we have approximately 12 years to set in motion a series of changes that will help us move from a fossil fuel-based society. In order to make the changes to go from a high carbon, unsustainable economy to one that is net zero and will help us achieve a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius on pre-industrial levels. But in order to do this is going to require change across all areas of society. So how we eat and drink and socialize, how we work and travel, all of that is going to have to shift into a more low carbon style. Businesses are going to have to assess how they develop their products and services, from design to supply chain engagement, assessing the lifestyle of the product, the lifespan of the product, and what will happen at end-of-life repurposing. These are all themes that are going to have to be addressed and challenges that are going to have to be undertaken by all areas of society. Shifting from this fossil fuel-based effort will require a Herculean task. Scientists, business leaders, policy experts are vocal in their concern that we may not be up to the task. With a backdrop of a growing movement questioning human contribution to climate change. Notably, the United States has withdrawn from the United Nations climate negotiations. These talks are an effort to establish collaboration and consensus and ensure we have a just transition as we move to a lower carbon lifestyle across the globe. With these themes in mind, difficult challenges ahead, I'm delighted to be speaking to Dr. Paula Owen, who is a climate change scientist and an expert in behavior change, who works actively across civil society with government and businesses to try and bring about change. Paula is an environment and sustainability expert who's been 3 decades of experience in energy, climate change, carbon footprinting and management. Paula has a doctorate from the University of Oxford in climate change chemistry and a master's degree in information science from City University in London. Welcome, Paula. I just want to say thanks very much. Delighted to hear about the work that you've been doing on climate change. Paula is formerly a director of the sustainability charity Form for the Future. She's developed and managed at the British Library as the Environment Information Services Desk. She worked for Government's Department, Environment and Energy on climate change, and spent 8 years at the Energy Saving Trust, where she developed the knowledge and insight resources and commercial consultancy capacity. So Paula was the project lead and the creator of the official UK government's carbon calculator, which was incredibly successful. And it was, when it was launched, it really helped the nation understand more about carbon footprint and the things they needed to do to make changes. Paula's a published environment author, has written a series of energy and carbon related publications. welcome, Paul. We're delighted to talk today about climate change and your personal journey as both an academic, studying the impacts of pollution on our atmosphere, as well as on our environment and the health and well-being, and a practitioner working to bring about change. Can you tell us a bit about your story, your passions, and how you came to study climate change chemistry?
Yes, certainly. Well, I didn't, when I was a kid, a teenager, I certainly didn't think I wanted to study climate change chemistry, because it, as a discipline and as a theme, it didn't exist as such in society at the time. I wanted to be a vet. I have a deep love of the natural environment and the creatures that live within it, much more though than I do of the human species at the moment. But I realized quite soon, so I took sciences and I enjoyed them, but I took the sciences over the arts because I wanted to be a vet. And I soon came to the realization in my teens that I would be the worst vet in the world, because I am so squeamish and I couldn't possibly do the things that needed to be done as a vet. So I had to think again. And I guess my understanding of the natural world, of the environmental conflicts and issues, even in those days. So I was growing up in the 80s, so there are lots of other things going on, lots of social unrest and injustice, but we were really getting to grips with the idea that we have an increasing problem with our relationship with the natural world and with other species. So I kind of fell into studying at university a mix of chemistry and environmental science. That was a kind of a new, unusual combination at the time. There were only about 2 universities in the country that undertook such a degree, but that's what I plumped for and really enjoyed the environmental side of things. The chemistry was, chemistry is chemistry, and I'd been doing it for years, but the environmental science side was very much in its infancy and developing as a academic discipline, and I found it fascinating. And I was very fortunate in my final year, because I still didn't know what I wanted to do after university. The environmental sector as a sector you could move into as a graduate didn't exist as it does today. But then I was talking to one of my tutors one day, and he mentioned the possibility of a place studying for a PhD on atmospheric chemistry, and I'd done a little bit on atmospheric chemistry through the environmental science modules, but this was a revelation. It was a potential dream come true, because it was at the University of Oxford, which I'd never dreamt that somebody like myself would end up at. And to cut a long story short, I ended up at the University of Oxford studying atmospheric chemistry.
At the time when you were studying atmospheric chemistry, what was the content of the study, and how were you, the analysis was being used in, were you profiling and looking at the changes in weather patterns and the pollution in the atmosphere, and were you beginning to model around that? Was in the days a few decades ago, what was the focus of the science?
Well, at the time, so this was early 90s, at the time the big issue was ozone depletion. That was still a very live issue. We were starting to address it in terms of cutting out CFCs, chlorofluoro products from our aerosols and refrigeration, but it was still a very big issue. So we were looking at pollution pathways in the atmosphere, in the lower atmosphere, so our troposphere, which is sort of ground level to about 10 kilometers high, and investigating. So this was lab work. It wasn't so much modeling, it was actually lab work. So we were in a darkened laboratory with lots of tubes and pumps and noxious chemicals, and we were looking to investigate pollution pathways. So when we were pumping all these different chemicals up into our atmosphere, what was happening to them when they were reacting with the natural constituents of the atmosphere. Fascinating work, but really backbreaking in terms of the physical side of things. At the time in the early 90s, the climate change issue was beginning to be recognised as a problem. Before that, it wasn't really, you know, the greenhouse effect and the idea of global warming was taught, but there was no urgency to the debate because people hadn't cottoned on to the immediacy of the threat. I finished my PhD in the kind of early to mid 90s, and I didn't want to stay in academia. I wanted to get out there into the real world and basically spread the message, I think, around climate change and the issues. And I was lucky enough to find a first position at the university, Manchester Metropolitan University, which was running the country's first climate change information program to try to get the word out there about what climate change would mean to the nation, to the world. And so that was my first, I always call it my proper job after my academic life. And that was fascinating because that was getting the word out there for the first time to all levels of society. So we worked with schools on school materials. We gave lectures for university students around the topic. And also we created resources for society at large to try to get them to kind of understand the issues involved with climate change. But it was hard because it seemed such a strange problem, and people didn't believe that we could have so much of an impact on the planet's atmospheric cycles through just burning coal, using petrol, burning gas. It seemed crazy, and of course in the earlier days we didn't get that much traction because it was too big an idea and too far away in terms of its potential damaging effects for people to really take it seriously.
Were you trying to get people to grasp and understand the issues, or was there any call to action at that time?
Yeah. No call to action. It was the first stage of a process of kind of change. It was trying to get people to wake up to the issue. So no, we weren't dealing with behavioral change or that kind of approach. No, it was simply getting the facts out there.
Information piece. So, which is an interesting point for your career, really, to take that direction, because you went from that work into ultimately working along a number of different types of organizations to then better understand how to engage, share the message, and then incorporate a call to action through that. Do you want to take us through a little bit about how that, so you, from the work from Manchester to, as a trajectory led to you beginning to understand more about that process and then develop some other tools, which I want to get to, and we can talk to as we further discuss your experience about how you then began to develop some very pioneering tools around this. So maybe you could talk a little bit about it.
So I spent a couple of years in Manchester running the climate change information program, and then I moved back down south to London to take up a position as head of environmental information at the British Library, which was a very exciting and kind of different role for me, but again, still stay on the information side of things. So that encompassed much more than just climate change, even though climate change is a huge topic. It encompassed the whole of environmental literature and environmental issues. So, and I was working with both the public through the reading rooms and the wonderful resources the British Library has, and then with professionals as well, as sort of paid consultancy services where they needed deep dive research into various environmental issues, and that's what we would do on their behalf. And that was a really interesting role, and I grew that, and that's why I went on to do another degree, the master's degree in information science, to learn more about the kind of the science behind information dissemination and this. This was at the earliest time of the internet becoming a useful tool, so we're kind of very, very different situation to where we are nowadays. But it was when the internet was beginning to show its promise in terms of being the world's information resource. I spent 4 years there, and then I moved to, which was at the time a very new sustainable development charity. So we'd moved on from environmentalism by then to this new term, sustainable development, sustainability, whatever that meant. So there was another information kind of job to be done to explain to people what sustainability and sustainable development meant. It wasn't just environmentalism, it was the step on. So that charity, as you mentioned earlier, Forum for the Future, had set up only 18 months previously, and I moved to the charity to develop an information tool, and it was to be a best practice repository of sustainability projects that were already in being or were completed, to try to show people what sustainability was. So it's great talking about this kind of thing in theory, but you really need examples of what it means in practice to understand what it's all about. And we developed a framework to unpack sustainability, and then every project we looked at to put out there in our database, for want of a better term, was then unpacked for its sustainability features and to help people understand what goes into a kind of a sustainable project, initiative, resource, product, whatever it may be. And by then, of course, climate change was very much on the agenda, and people were waking up to the implications of our modern lifestyles, especially around energy use, travel, not so much food. We didn't even go there with our diets in those days. It was seen to be just too far. And spent 3 happy years there, and then moved to the Energy Saving Trust, where you and I worked together many moons ago. And there I was in charge of the trust's data, its information. I was tasked with improving its knowledge base, using that knowledge base, working with various government departments, whether it be the energy side of things or the transport issues, and providing data and information and hopefully a little bit of knowledge along the way around energy and then the implications for our climate.
So there's an evolution in time and also experience. So you were in the early days trying to sort of get the basic around people, explaining the impacts, potential impacts of some of the emissions, NOx and carbon and some of the other things that are in the atmosphere. And then you began to move into sort of from the understanding the information side, and then the sustainability piece. So as the time is going by, and actually as the science is beginning to change real time for us as well, so this begins to move from being something that seems fantasy or some kind of something very hard for people to understand, is slowly beginning to become a reality. So now you have actually come on to the Energy Saving Trust, where you're using sort of a bit from all of your sciences now. So the information piece, trying to actually provide some analysis on emissions. And I know one of the common things the trust like to do is explain to people how many bus loads of double-decker buses worth of this emission or that action would have, and trying to quantify these things in a realistic way and getting people to understand. And I think it was a fascinating time too, as businesses were beginning to grapple with this, because it did lead to that challenge, that necessity for ensuring that this information is valid, as companies began to make very large claims about what they were doing and how this was having an impact. So it'd be interesting to just hear how that journey to, so what some of your learnings were that you took away from both Form for the Future and from the Energy Saving Trust as these evolutions were occurring, and the importance of data and the importance of reaching individuals and saying, well, there's a role for all of us to play in this. And of course, it's very complicated, and it does touch on each aspect of our lives. So maybe and I know we'll get to the point where we understand where we are today, which is actually another decade beyond this point we're discussing right now, and we have moved that much further on this journey. So maybe you could just reflect a little bit on the trust and what some of your learnings and takeaway and Form for the Future were as well.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So by the time I got to the Energy Saving Trust, it was more about engaging people with action rather than explaining the basics to them. Although there was still a big job to do with explaining the potential implications of a accelerated change in our global climate. But it was really more about calls to action. And the Energy Saving Trust was a big player in that for the domestic sector, in particular, in energy efficiency. So we were engaged most of our time in trying new ways and techniques for getting the message across of what people, normal, everyday people in their homes and at work and when they're traveling, could do to help reduce their carbon footprint. Now, it was the mid-90s when the term carbon footprint first came into existence. And of course, there's another information job to explain to people what that is and what that means to the individual and what the number means. 5 tons, 3 tons, 100 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. What on earth is that? So, as you're saying about the number of double-decker buses of carbon dioxide saved through one action or another, that was we learned a lot about how to relate to the kind of the man and woman in the street around how to make it real for them, because it's not real otherwise. You know, a gas that is tasteless, it has no smell, you can't see it, it doesn't seem to do it much harm to you on a day-to-day level, but being so potentially dangerous, it's a hard thing to get across. So when the department, Defra, the Department of Environment and Rural Affairs, decided they wanted to produce a carbon calculator for the domestic sector and talk to the Energy Saving Trust about that and asked if they could second some of our sort of data experts in to help. I jumped at that chance because I thought that would be a really exciting thing to be working on. At the time, there were a few carbon calculators out there that were created sometimes by energy companies or other people trying to sell something, and they weren't that great. So it was really encouraging that the government wanted to actually put the time, effort and resource and budget into creating a resource for the British public that would help them understand what a carbon footprint was, what the size of their personal carbon footprint was, and then what they could do about it. But of course, the first thing to do was to build it and to get people to use it, get them through the process to give them their carbon footprint in terms of tons of this gas that they were responsible for putting into the atmosphere. So that, again, is not a call to action yet. It's more a this is what a carbon footprint is, this is yours, and this is what you can do to reduce it. So that's the third level of the process. And it was fascinating. We had quite a free range for what we could do with the calculator, and we made it fun. That's the big learning for me from that project. If you saw it, and you can't see it today, it doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. It was a fun, interactive, non-government looking resource, and we had much success with it in the first year. We had about 1 million people use it with a 40% completion rate, which was quite an achievement, because we asked people about 70 questions about their lives, but we did it in such a way that it was fun for them to answer the questions, so we got such a high completion rate. But then when we were, and having your carbon footprint in isolation from anybody else's, you don't know if it's good, bad or indifferent. So what we had to do was to show people the kind of the average, and then show them what they were to that average. But that didn't really work, because nobody likes to think of themselves as average. So we then, once we had more and more data and information about the people who had kind of calculated their footprint, we could refine the answers and the information we gave back to the people by saying, people like me with this kind of profile, with this kind of family size, with this size of house or flat, and showing them more information that pertains to them and their lifestyle. Then we could get traction with them, and then we could lead them into action. So it was fascinating to go through that, and we did a lot of focus groups, and we walked participants through the process, and then talked to them about what we found and what they could do, just to get an idea of what was palatable for them at the time, in terms of reducing their energy use, maybe reducing their travel, especially of course flying and things like that. So so by that time, by the mid-90s, early noughties, we were in the realm of getting people to take action. That was the main concern. We needed people to actually take action, not just listen passively to the information we were throwing at them.
And what did you find were the triggers in your analysis and research? What were some of the things that fun was one of the things that people engaged with? Were there other things that made people want to, they don't want to just be average, so they want to do perhaps better, keeping up or doing better than the Joneses, as it were? So what were some of the other things that you thought that you found that came out of the sort of work from the Trust that helped you understand more about how to engage people and how to motivate change?
Well, another big learning was you can use guilt and doom and gloom to a certain extent to get people to take action, but it doesn't work for the majority. Mm-hmm. You can use guilt with certain areas of society, certain sectors of society, and you can use a doom and gloom scenario with other sectors, but they tend to be a little bit more green anyway. Maybe if they're motivated by that guilt for what they're doing is wrong, and doom and gloom will work for some people, but it'll really turn a lot of people off, because they'll feel too disempowered by the idea of the enormity of the issue, and we're all going to die anyway, so why bother? Let's go out with a bang rather than a whimper. So it was becoming more and more clear to me that you have to engage people in different ways, not to make things more flippant than they were, because we were talking about very serious issues, but to approach the issue in such a way that you give people hope. You don't chastise them too much for what they're doing if they lead a particularly high carbon footprint lifestyle at the moment, and just kind of leading them to better, lower carbon lifestyle choices through their own decision-making process rather than being guilt-tripped into something. So that they were very important lessons for me, that you have to bring people along with you. Don't depress them too much. Don't finger wag and guilt trip them too much. Give them something simple they can do just to show that it's not that hard. And yeah, so they were the lessons that were really hitting home with me as the years went by.
And were there others that you were working with beyond just the trust, maybe a politician or other influencers, other organizations that understood this and were able to relate these messages? Was there anybody that inspired you, that that you feel influenced you and helped on this journey?
The main influencer on my journey through this is actually somebody I worked for. I'd known him through my childhood because he'd been on kind of kiddie television programs on kind of talking about environmental issues, and eventually he was one of the founders of Forum for the Future, and that's Jonathan Porritt. So I knew him from a distance for a long time. I'd seen him on the TV, and then I'd been to lectures he'd given and been at conferences where he was, and always admired him, and then ended up working alongside him at Forum for the Future, which is one of the reasons I left the library to join Forum, because it was a chance to work with somebody like Jonathan. And yeah, so he's had the biggest influence, I think, and we're friends to this day. So he's had, yeah, so I'd definitely say Jonathan as my biggest influence through my career.
And what do you think about Jonathan that makes him sort of special and as an individual? What is it? What characteristics about his personality do you think that really help?
For him, he really doesn't care what people would think of him. He is very forthright. He tells it as it is, and he has no fear of anything, and very plain speaking, very forthright, and but he does things with humor as well. So yeah, he comes from a position of certain privilege, and I think he's used that privilege to the best use that he could possibly. So he has access to very important people, but he doesn't kowtow down to them. He will just tell them what they probably don't want to hear. He's worked a lot with big corporates and business, and just tells them what they need to hear, but what they don't want to hear, I think.
That honest truth, which more and more people, I think, are beginning to more willing to say. But so he was clearly ahead of his time, and was very influential for many, many years, and still continues to be in this space, and is really, I think, really one of the standout individuals as well, who for the many reasons you mentioned, I think, brings a truth and a reality, and that plain speaking approach, which I think you also have, which I think is a real a testament to I think inspiring other people is those individuals who really do, I think, are honest with themselves and honest with others is such an admirable quality in today's world, where we have so much confusion and so much misinformation around. On this journey, you went I think it's like it's a continuum in many ways, because then I was really interested in discussing sort of where you are now and how you move those projects into developing, as we mentioned before, some sort of very pioneering ideas around information and engagement, and then ultimately behavior change. So maybe we could address a little bit about how those games and that gaming approach developed.
So 10 years ago, almost to the month, I left the Energy Saving Trust and decided to take a different approach to my career and set up my own small but perfectly formed sort of agency, a research and advice consultancy in the area of sustainability. And in particular, because at the time, currency was still high on the whole idea of carbon footprinting, and at the time, the interest and feeling around the environmental movement, sustainability movement, and then climate change as an issue, I think it was quite buoyant still then, in about 2010. Even though we'd had the crash in 2008, which really affected things, but still we were riding on a little bit of a high still, especially in terms of people's understanding of the issues and people's engagement. But then I think everything over the last decade, everything went kind of crashing down in terms of environmental issues. And so I decided to go out on my own in this wonderful decade that we've just lived through, and so started out with a small, as I say, agency, working with a lot of the colleagues and clients I'd worked with whilst I was as seconded into government, and EST colleagues and others, and it was great, and it was working well, and just picked up on this new idea that was bubbling up around gamification. Awful word, I don't like to use it, but people understand very much now what gamification is. If you don't, it's basically the idea of using gaming techniques and mechanics and theories and the different things that make games, especially online games, appealing and making people want to come back for more. And at the same time, something we'd done at the Energy Saving Trust in the couple of years before I left, we'd created a pack of cards, playing cards. They were all about energy efficiency measures, but they were delivered to the reader in the form of a game. It's called Top Trumps. Kind of the brand name is Top Trumps, but it's a game where you try and win everybody else's cards by picking the best categories with the highest value. And we use that game dynamic for this energy efficiency version of the game. When I was looking at this at the Energy Saving Trust, we weren't very creative with the way it looked, and it was just a bit of it didn't go anywhere because it didn't look very good. So when I set up my own company, and I had a bit of time and I could play around with ideas, and I thought, why not resurrect this playing card idea as a way of getting information across to people. And I also kind of a friend of mine who is a graphic artist, I managed to get her interested in maybe collaborating to create a pack of cards that looked good and but got the message across at the same time. And that's where the games started from, just a bit of an experiment. We could do it because we work for ourselves, and so why not try it? And it took off, and the whole gamification thing took off at the same time. So we rode a bit of a wave on that, on the interest in using gaming techniques to get important information across, whether it be in the environmental sector or finance or sports and well-being and fitness, where, you know, things like the Fitbit and that kind of approach to your own fitness, it worked really well. The whole gamification techniques with leaderboards and leveling up and stars and rewards and that kind of thing. So it just works with the environmental sector as well. So that's where that came from.
So from that initial developing the Top Trumps themed games, you then created Eco Action Games, and now you use a whole host of games. So tell us a little bit about what Eco Action Games is and how you use that now for various audiences and in different applications.
So we created this first initial pack of cards and didn't really know what was going to happen with them. I had this idea that we'd get a rich corporate to fund the production of them, and we'd get them into every school in the country, for example, so that, you know, school children would use them. And they were, you know, simple actions you could do at home to save carbon, save energy, save money, and a bit of fun, but a lot of education. But that didn't happen. Because we were still massively in the recession, so there was no money sort of sloshing around for this kind of thing. But I also happened to be working for a bank at the time, working with them on staff engagement and environmental issues around getting their staff to do stuff at work. And I showed them the drawings and the mock-ups for the cards, and they thought it would be a brilliant thing for them to have to give to their staff, which kind of surprised me a bit, because I thought this was more an educational tool for maybe younger people. But no, it ended up our first client for the games was a big corporate bank who wanted them for their adult workers, and so then it kind of expanded from there. So then I realized that maybe I was looking at the wrong audience, and I didn't need to look at a young audience. It could be an adult audience, and it took off, and we sold lots of these cards. So just decided to experiment with other games to see if we could use other games as this kind of educational resource. And it just kind of snowballed. And what I realized was I couldn't be a consultancy services company and sell games. So I had to set up a separate entity for that. So Eco Action Games is basically a company that develops, produces and sells environmental educational resources, but they're disguised as games, card games, board games, kind of physical kind of games. And we've developed the themes, so now we cover pretty much all environmental sustainability issues you could think of. And we developed a suite of games to help educate people around the Sustainable Development Goals, because I was getting, over the last 3 or 4 years, people were asking about the SDGs, the global goals, and asking if we had any resources to help teach their staff about the SDGs. And we didn't, but now we do. And looking at online games, I wanted to keep the games real, because I think we spend enough time in front of our computers and our laptops and our tablets and our phones. So I wanted to get people off all of that equipment and kind of playing games with each other. The social aspect I thought was really important, but I also had to realize that if you could turn a game into an online resource, then you could reach a hell of a lot more people at one time. So there are a few of our games that we've created, either apps or online versions of, that we sell into companies, and they use them as a staff engagement tool across the world. So and our latest, which is still in development, is a climate emergency game. So we've all now, in the last year or two, woken up to the fact there is a climate emergency, although it's been kind of sidelined at the moment because of the other emergency crisis that's going on. But once we're over our immediate issues with the corona crisis, then we should turn our attention back to the climate crisis. And so we are developing a climate emergency game to help people understand what their lifestyles may have to look like to be within a degree or 2 of warming, and what a 5 degree of warming lifestyle looks like. So just to get people to comprehend the changes that will be needed to keep our sort of the increasing global temperatures under control.
The early part of your career, when you were trying to communicate this is possible, this burning of coal and other gases and other fossil fuels is creating a change, just to convey that to people, and they're not able to grasp it and realize it. And then as you go through your career where we are now, do people do grasp this, you say now, and your games are one way to reach people. Is the science another way to reach people? Or are famous athletes and musicians the way to reach people? Is schooling the way to reach people? What's going to be that mechanism that's going to get everybody to make those changes that you're discussing in your climate emergency game, that says this is the type of lifestyle we need to lead in order to keep ourselves under the 1.5 degrees? And this is what you're going to need to do. What are those points at this point going to be? Because we know that those triggers have changed throughout the couple you've now been talking about, a few decades of your own career and experience. And if we follow that trajectory of your career and what's been happening, we can see now that we're at a real turning point. So what do you think now from this moment is going to be those triggers that are going to help us move on to the next stage we need to be at?
If you'd asked me this question a couple of months ago, I wouldn't have said science, because science was out of favour, wasn't it? Experts were out of favour. We didn't like data and numbers and overwhelming evidence that pointed to the fact that we were on a trajectory for a lot of warming over the next century. But you're asking me today, so now I will absolutely change my answer, and I think the science will be a very powerful weapon in the armory of us who are desperately trying to get people to wake up and embrace the fact that they have to take action. It won't be just one thing. You mentioned a number of different approaches just now when you were kind of asking me to maybe pick one. But so the science, definitely after this crisis is over, the corona crisis, I think science and scientists and people who know stuff will be much more respected by government officials as well as the public. And combine that with the myriad of evidence we have out there for the changes that are happening that we didn't have a decade, 2 decades, definitely 3 decades ago. We've got that happening now. And yes, you mentioned, you know, do we need pop stars and athletes? And we need all of them, because we were talking earlier, you're into football, I'm not. But so a load of footballers kind of talking about climate change, for me, who wouldn't make any difference. But, you know, for a football fan, their favourite footballer, don't ask me to name one, suddenly came out and talked about this kind of thing with an earnest kind of approach to it, then maybe that would work for them. And then you've got fantastic bold moves from certain groups. You know, Coldplay, they're not going to tour anymore until they can find a way of doing it quite as low carbon as possible. And I know Massive Attack are doing a big piece in terms of working out their carbon footprint. They're working with the Tyndall Centre on that, and how they can reduce it. So we need all areas of society and all interest groups to have their flag bearers for us, and then we've got a chance.
And we need those politicians to lead. And for a long time, and I think there was a very interesting point in the history we were talking about when Tony Blair was the prime minister, so that was a few decades ago, and he said, don't ask me to tell people they can't fly, because that's politically untenable, and I will not be reelected if I ask people not to fly. Now, we have moved on from that point, and politicians, although none are boldly making that pronouncement yet, a number of countries are beginning to take serious action and beginning to realize that less flying, and obviously the court case around Heathrow Airport was very interesting, because many of climate change campaigners know that it's not consistent to say we are going to be able to keep emissions at 1.5 pre-industrial level and expand flying. It's not possible. So that's encouraging to see that this is now becoming something people are beginning to accept. So do you think there's a political will that's changing? We get hope sometimes, and then that hope is often dashed, but then there is, I think, some lights. There are some politicians now, there are some who seem to really grasp, despite the problems we're having on a global level, where some of the climate naysayers are having a strong voice. Is there an undertone? Do you think that movement, there's a swell of support, and that politicians will get caught up in that and take some of those bold actions that are required?
Again, if we roll back this, say, a month, and if you were asking me this question a month ago, I would have said, yes, in the last 12 months, I can really see a difference in people's attitudes to flying. I've got lots of environmental friends who, proclaim they're environmentalists to their core, yet very frequent flyers. And I'd often mused to myself how they could disassociate that flying, that frequent flying, from the rest of their belief systems. But over the last 12 months, I've seen a change in their behavior as well. So it's and there's this Swedish term, I can't say it in Swedish, but the flight shaming that's going on there. I mean, whether shaming is right or wrong, we could argue that for a long time, but I don't think 5 or 10 years ago you would have got away with a flight shaming kind of approach to trying to get people to reduce their flights, the number of flights they take a year. So yes, I think we were finally making good progress, good but slow progress, and the Heathrow court decision was amazing. Of course, we do have a prime minister now who said he would have thrown himself down in front of a bulldozer if Heathrow had gone forward. So that would have been interesting to watch. But again, everything's changed since the coronavirus. So when we come out at the other end of this period, what's going to be left of the aviation industry anyway? And we've had Flybe go out of business already, and we're going to see a lot more of that over the next 6 to 12 months, I think. So it'll be interesting to see what's left of the aviation industry at the end of this, and how they can reinvigorate themselves in, hopefully, a more sustainable way, and a way that will really help the monumental challenge of getting to a net zero economy, global economy.
You did mention coronavirus. We've conducted this interview without really saying much about the situation that we're in, which are really literally unprecedented times. Many climate change campaigners find it very fascinating that they have been clamoring for change for quite a long time and against a lot of social resistance. and yet the virus has thrust upon us that change, and many people are beginning to realize that there could be some real advantages. Many people have been campaigning around climate, say, hey, if we fly less, if we travel less, if we focus a little bit more on our communities and our local engagement and develop our sense of being and home, this is a healthy thing and will produce healthy results for the community around us. And for many people, and myself included, who is a sort of on the go kind of person, it is very interesting, and it's a fascinating social experience to live through this, where we are being forced to make these changes, and we are seeing, I think, a lot of innovation and a lot of interesting things come out of what's the current situation we're in. So we're all having to adjust and working now using different platforms, and many of the different activities that I'm involved with beyond my work and my volunteer work. Everything has ground to a halt, but in response, many of the organizations and individuals are looking at and creating very innovative ways to move on. And that is very much the human spirit. That is why you're here and I'm here, because we come from an ancestral link, which is survivors. And that is the human spirit, is one of survival. So this has created a real shift for us, but then it's interesting to see the response from many, many people is to respond positively. And I'm hoping that some of that will continue on once the virus is contained and it's safe for us to all travel again and to move again, that we'll hold some of these learnings, and we will think about our travel and think about, do we need to make that journey? Can we just use a video or an audio engagement that will help us do that? And maybe instead our time is better spent taking a walk around our local park. And that in that way, it's healthy for us and healthy for the communities around us. Are you getting the sense? I mean, we don't know. This is all such an unprecedented time and so unknown. It's hard to know, but it is fascinating to see. I can look here from London and see the air is actually, the sky is literally changing in front of my eyes in the last couple of weeks, as we've seen a reduction in emissions. And we, of course, all the scientists and the people who are able to see the globe from afar are able to see an incredible impact instantly on the environment and on emissions from this global lockdown that we're all experiencing right now.
Absolutely. And so a lot of my work in recent years has been around air pollution, and in particular nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter, which are so detrimental to people's health and cause, in the UK alone, 40,000 early deaths a year because of air pollution, which is mainly through emissions from transportation methods. And globally, I'm not sure of the number, but it's going to be near 500,000 people globally every year that have early deaths from air pollution, linked to air pollution, poor air quality. And what they are saying, I mean, this is so extreme what we are going through now, and nobody wants to live like this. But the positive consequence of living as we are, as a planet currently, is that global air emissions, and by that air pollution emissions, I mean that both from a ground source level, which are your nitrogen dioxide, your NOx, and your particulate matter PM, which affect our health, our respiratory systems, as well as higher up the carbon dioxide emissions, which cause planetary disruption, but not disruption to our individual health on the day-to-day basis. The number of early deaths from air pollution, from the lack of air pollution, is going to be immense. And when the reckoning happens in 6 months, 12 months, whenever we've got this thing under control, and we see how many deaths we've had globally from the coronavirus pandemic, and then we look to how many deaths have been avoided by the reduction in air pollution, it'll be very interesting to see what that net result will be.
And that
will be very sobering.
it does bring up that point, which is the underlying debate for leaders and the scientific community around the virus, which is around what are the sort of trade-offs right now. Unfortunately, we're in a situation in some countries where the trade-offs are, because of the lack of medical supplies, are those who are going to have an opportunity and a chance to go on and live, and those, unfortunately, who are in such dire shape that they are having to choose. And this is obviously, this is I think something that many of these people who became nurses and doctors never ever anticipated they would have to be forced with this kind of decision. But this is the world we've now developed around us, which requires this kind of thinking, and how we avert one catastrophe in exchange for another, and how we can actually lead a life which is going to be the safest and healthiest for civilization. It's been a fascinating range of discussions, and we've really covered many decades in the evolution of where we are with understanding the problems and with understanding what are going to be the solutions and what is each personal responsibility for that. I wondered, we won't have answers. Perhaps we'll have to catch up again in another year to find out where we are and what happened post-coronavirus. But it'd be good to know if there's just sort of a closing note, if there's sort of somebody that you think you would like to meet, maybe whether they be living today or not, that a person who so inspires you that you would like to meet, and what would you like to discuss with this person if you had a chance to?
Well, it's not so much so inspires me, but I saw this question beforehand, so I had to ponder it a while. And the person I would like to meet is myself on my deathbed. Hopefully not for a few more decades, but I would really like to meet myself and just check in and see how I feel about it all, and how my life has panned out, and whether I felt I did enough. I don't think anybody can feel they've ever done enough. But yeah, that's who I'd like to meet.
Well, certainly that ability to reflect and see and have that vision would certainly help to shape, I think, and inspire our own lives, knowing at that moment whether we achieved the things we wanted to and we had the impact that we wanted to do. But well, good luck to you. May you continue on with the excellent work that you're doing. And as I said, perhaps we'll have a chance to touch base again and reflect on these things in a year's time. But we very much appreciate that and look forward to seeing your next projects and the next games.
Thank you, Karen.
Okay, all the best.
You too.